Dr. Sarah Pearson is CEO of Australian National University Enterprise and visiting fellow at the ANU's College of Business and Economics. She's passionate about innovation, and we were fortunate to be able to interview her about her work and how innovators deal with unknowns.
So one of the things that we'd really like to talk to you about is how entrepreneurs deal with the unknown. Really, to be an entrepreneur, the unknown's your stock in trade. So can you say a little bit about that and what the adaptive mechanisms are that they use?
I think to start with, from my perspective, when we're talking about unknown, we're actually talking about a risk as well. So it's how do they take risks? And entrepreneurs are natural risk takers. They have to be, otherwise they would never get into starting up a business, because most businesses fail. I've got someone that I know who's been very, very successful, but he did 10 startups, or 9 startups before the 10th one actually worked. So entrepreneurs are very, very familiar with the unknown. And I think part of that is then having an acceptance that they don't know, and that might mean failure. So I think the first thing I'd say is entrepreneurs actually accept it. They accept that they live in the unknown. That's the territory they're going into. It's as if they are explorers who are going to the next frontier, and so it's very much unknown. So they're prepared for failure. But then also there are strategies that people use to manage the unknown. And obviously if you don't know something, the first thing you do is try to find something out about that unknown. So you might have a new technology and you don't know, or a new product or service, you don't know if the market is going to accept it or not. So one thing you might do is actually talk to the market. So what an entrepreneur will do is they'll have what's called rapid prototyping is one tool that they use, or producing a minimum viable product. So something that people can touch, maybe taste, whatever it is that will help them to understand what that product is. And then they'll test that with a test market. If they're entrepreneurs inside a large company, they actually have test markets. So they might use Japan, for instance, as a test market for a new product. So that's another way of coping with the unknown. Do a little test first. They'll also run the product development through a process where they have stage gates. So you don't know what the end outcome is going to be, but if you have some milestones and you know what you need to get to by that milestone, if you don't get to that, then you can stop. So that's a staged approach to getting to a known about an unknown. And they will employ what's called rapid or fast failure. So instead of just continuing on with something until you get to a point where you've spent years and years doing it, you actually have these points where they can stop and go, no, it's not working, so we're going to stop that, we'll do something else. The other thing that entrepreneurs will do is they will do market research. So really understand the market before they even design a product. So right at the beginning I talked about if you've got a product idea and you're taking that to market, you do a bit of prototype and test it. But another thing you can do is actually just look in the market to see what some of the gaps are, and then design a product or a service to go into that. So that's a known, but using an unknown way of getting to that known, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So are there such things as good or beneficial unknowns as opposed to nasty ones for innovators? I mean, one thing that occurs to me is that an innovator is a little bit like a researcher.
Yes.
And as you know, to do research, you have to find unknowns.
Yes.
Otherwise, there's nothing to be done.
Yes.
Does
yes.
innovation work the same way, or?
Yes, it can. I mean, the idea would be that you find an unknown that has a market need. So let's say people are saying they want to go and spend 6 months up in space. Go back a few years now, but let's say they're 6 months up in space, and no one knows. It's unknown how you can do that. In fact, it might even seem impossible. So it's even further than unknown. It's like, no, there's no solution to this. So for an entrepreneur or an innovator, that's perfect, because if you can find a solution to that, then it's probably quite difficult to find that solution, but your competitors are unlikely to find it. So that gives you a bit of a niche. So definitely there's some good unknowns in entrepreneurship and innovation.
Now, you were the inaugural Open Innovation Champion
Yes.
at Cadbury.
Yes. Mrs. Willy Wonka.
Right. Can you tell us something about what open innovation is, and how does it differ from common garden variety innovation?
So they tend to describe it as closed innovation and open innovation. So closed innovation for a company would be that they employ, let's say they employ 10 people who are going to do their R&D, their research and development for them. They own them, they're paid by them. The only ideas are coming from that group of people that they own. They'd quite likely be people that know that industry very well. Quite usually they're people who've worked in that industry for a long time. So which is great, they have that depth of knowledge. And that can be good for some circumstances. But what open innovation does, it says instead of putting a boundary around your people who are giving you ideas for new products and services, you actually make it a semi-permeable membrane so that ideas and people can come in and out. So in other words, you look outside for new ideas. And that has the advantage of finding people with ideas outside of your traditional idea base. It also helps you find ideas that will give you solutions faster. Let's say, for instance, a classic example I talk a lot about is if you're trying to get water into chocolate, you need to understand water in oil emulsions. Now, if the team that you have paid, your employees, don't understand emulsions, what do you do? Well, what you can do is you can go outside your company. You can talk to the paint industry. The paint industry understands water in oil emulsions very well. They've solved a lot of those problems. So then you can just translate the solutions that they've developed straight into your application, and so you manage to get yourself to market faster. So that's the basis of open innovation. You're trying to get better solutions faster so you can get to market faster.
Okay. Are there any risks or downsides with that? I mean, lots of companies want to be proprietary about
Yes.
their special things, and
Yes.
so does this leakage
Yes.
create problems for them?
I think it has problems on the macro and the micro level. So it had problems there are challenges, sorry, not problems. There are challenges for the company, and there are also challenges for the individual. You imagine if you're an individual who knows all about food, and you have pride in who you are, that you can solve challenges, R&D challenges in the food sector. For you to go outside and talk to people outside of that sector, that's really challenging who you are. And then getting back to the knowns and unknowns, then that's unknown for you. So what is your place going to be in that company? So that can be a real risk and a challenge for people. And then for the company, the challenge is that you don't want to be giving away confidential information. You talked about companies being proprietary, and that seems to be the biggest barrier for companies to taking on the open approach, because they tend to think if they're going to be open, it means they've got to open and tell everybody everything. So instead of everybody having unknowns about what that company is doing, suddenly they think that everyone's going to have knowns about what that company is doing. But actually what you do is you decide which one of your knowns are you going to make no longer unknown outside, and that they're safe to do that. So if you had something really strategically important for your company and strategically important to keep it secret, so for instance the recipe for Coca-Cola, you're not going to take that out and start to get people to help give you ideas about that. It'll be the things that are not so risky that you'll take outside and look for solutions for. Yeah, so from the perspective of large companies, when we're talking about open innovation and some challenges they have if they open up, I talked earlier about the challenge of telling everybody what you know. In other words, people might know your strategy and what you're going to take to market. But there's also the challenge from a patent and an IP perspective. So
IP is
intellectual property. Yes, sorry. So you might have done a piece of research and development, and you might not have patented it yet. You might not have protected it yet. So if you then go outside and ask people for their ideas, it might actually pollute your intellectual property. So you have to be quite careful about that. And for a large company, that's a big challenge, because large companies, multinationals, they don't know everything. The unknown is, what on earth does the whole company know? They don't know what the whole company knows. So they have to deal with that unknown before they can go outside and deal with the unknown of what other people might have. So quite often the way a large company will deal with that is they'll say, don't come and talk to me until you've protected your idea. Because if it's protected, that means that it must be unique, and they don't have it inside their company. So that way they don't need to know what's inside the company, because the patent attorneys have already worked that out for them. But that is a challenge for large companies.
Okay. Has this been applied in governments or public sector organizations as
Yes,
well?
absolutely it has. In fact, it's a bit of one of my latest passions, is the transformation of what government is and how government delivers its services. People are now saying, well, perhaps the private sector would be very good at delivering more government services than government does at the moment. Or perhaps one can go outside and find solutions to government service challenges by asking the public, for instance. I talked earlier on about talking to your customers. So there's actually a company called IDEO, which is very, very good at this. And they will actually not just talk to customers, they'll watch them. And in fact, so they watch them to see what they're doing with their products and services, and then learn how to improve them. So some government departments, Medicare for instance, they actually bring customers in to fill out forms. They watch them filling out the forms and realise that they really need to change the forms, and use that then to develop forms that are better suited to their customers. So that's one example. And the other way it's used is in public policy. So I don't know if you come across crowdsourcing, but that's used in public policy too. Some people will use a wiki approach to developing a policy. So for instance, I think it was 1952, so quite a while ago, the policing policy in New Zealand used this crowdsourcing approach to developing public policy. So they got the crowd, civil society, to tell them, okay, yeah, that's a good idea, that's not such a good idea.
So
I think
that wouldn't have been done using a wiki in 1952. How did they do it at that
I
time?
don't know how they did it at that time. I could find out. If you look at Victoria, so Melbourne was developing its city plans, and they used a wiki sort of approach and a blog sort of approach. That was that crowd again, so it's been used recently.
So what about complex problems like climate change or organised crime? Are there lessons that they can learn from this entrepreneurial approach to unknowns?
Yes, I think there'd be a couple. One is, and what I love about the open approach is that you're no longer confined, and you'd know all about this, you're no longer confined within the one discipline. When you go open, you can choose any discipline you like. I mean, when I was head of open innovation at Cadbury, I tasked the team with looking outside of confectionery for solutions, because I thought that's where you'd beat your competitors, because you'd find solutions that your competitors would never think of. And when we looked in defence and translated solutions defence into confectionery. So back to the complexity issue, I think by being open, it really helps you draw together diverse thinking from all sorts of areas that you might not traditionally think of. So not even just researchers. You might think outside the box and find there's a similar challenge that's found within some industry sector, and you can bring those people in. So really it's about finding people who might have solved some similar challenge but in a completely different context, and bringing them in with their solutions and seeing if you can get it to work. And then I think probably the rapid prototyping approach. So not thinking you've got to come up with a whole solution, because complexity is difficult to, it would take you years to come up with the final whole solution, but by using rapid prototyping you can actually test some of your mini solutions, your minimal viable product solutions earlier on, so then it gives you a chance to play around a bit before you get to the final solution.
So what is it that makes people able to take risks? Is it a personality thing, or are there other factors as well?
I think it's a personality thing. I mean, it's a bit like being an entrepreneur or being a risk taker. No, it's not. It's a bit like being an entrepreneur. People think you can teach entrepreneurship, and you can teach some of the skills around entrepreneurship and risk taking, but I think it is deep down, I think it's a personality thing as well. And from my perspective, I think, having been a researcher as well, I think it's being an adventurer. The wonderful thing about research, and I used to describe this to young people, is it's a bit like going to the jungle, you're chopping down the trees and trying to find something new. And I think risk takers are like that. They're excited about the new. They're excited about going into the jungle and seeing what's there. So I think it is absolutely a personality thing. I think people like myself and others who do this sort of take on this risk taking, and others a lot more than I do, would probably have been people who went to the Antarctic or the Arctic, several hundred years ago. But where is that now? I think now we're seeing that in the entrepreneurship space, and young people are flocking to it. And I think part of it is because it's a bit exciting, taking those risks and being on the edge. So yes, I think it is a personality thing.
If you could lay out an ideal education for this kind of person, what would that look like? I mean, the British and the Australian systems, they specialize people very, very quickly. So your typical honors graduate here is beautifully trained, but in one area. And then we invite them to become narrower still. For their PhD, they become the world's expert on cockroach cuticles or something like that. If that's not the kind of education that's needed for looking outside, what would be?
Well, firstly, I'd say we need both. So it's not like I'd throw out the need for people to be able to dig deep down and become real experts in something small. We absolutely need people to have that training. But if you're going to train people like that, then I think you need additional training, which is also, open up the blinds and open them up to other ways of thinking, other disciplines, and also give them skills to be able to collaborate with people who are culturally different, think differently, know different things. So I think that training is really important for them. I remember several years ago now, when I was working in cancer research, I got very excited about a research team being set up in the US, which is going to involve medics, physicists, chemists, biologists, psychologists, a whole range of people, and getting really excited about that. You still needed the chemists and the physicists and the rest of it, but they needed to know how to work together as a team. So I think if you're going to keep on with that training, you've got to teach people how to work in those different collaborative environments. But I think also then you need to train some generalists. So we need to have people who can spot the connections, make those unusual connections,
That's been fantastic. Thank you so
Yeah, it's been
much.
great.
Great,
Yeah.
good. Yeah, I've enjoyed it too.